OK, now we're going to catch up on all the day's issues with Josh Frydenberg, the Resources Minister, who's just landed in Brisbane and joins us from our Brisbane studio. Thanks for joining us, Minister.
Nice to be with you, Chris.
Look, I want to ask you first off about this childcare announcement from Bill Shorten. It's politically very strong for him, a $3 billion giveaway to families. These are often swinging voters. How does the government compete with that?
I think when people have a closer look at this announcement, there'll be more questions than answers. I mean, firstly, as you said, Chris, this is another $3 billion on the speedometer. And who's going to pay for this? Already we are seeing Labor make hundreds of billions of dollars worth of spending commitments over time, and no way that that is being funded or costed, indeed, in many cases, by them. Secondly, they're abandoning the restrictions or the caps that we've placed on the money that is provided to the service providers, and that's just a recipe for price inflation. And we saw that last time Labor was in government, when prices in childcare went up by 53%, an average of $73 a week for an Australian family. And again, that will be problematic because the money will be just pocketed by the childcare providers as opposed to the families. And perhaps most worrying of all, they've got rid of the work activity test. Now, this is extremely important in producing a workforce participation dividend as a result of putting more money into childcare, which we have done and which we'll continue to do. And we are going to see, tens of thousands of Australian families see more people enter into the workforce as a result of the greater childcare support that we are providing. Whereas the Labor Party, by removing that workforce activity test, are putting no restrictions on it, and therefore won't get the people studying or working or volunteering as our policy will.
Well, there's a bit to pick through there from your answer. Let me pick up a couple of issues. First up, you talk about the way the increased money into childcare might just increase costs. Of course, the Coalition has a plan to increase some payments to families for childcare as well, so the same would apply there. Isn't the real solution to lowering costs in childcare to deregulate it? It's over-regulated, became very heavily regulated during the Gillard years.
It certainly did, but as you know, they're a result of compacts between the federal and the state governments, and they're very difficult to unwind, as that has shown. But over-regulation is a problem. But the benefit of our policy, as opposed to Labor, is we're providing more to those people who need it most. And it's a sliding scale. The less you earn, the more sensitive you will be to the childcare prices, and the more difficult it is for you to enter into the workforce. So that's what we've targeted, and we've done that after Productivity Commission assessment and analysis and recommendations to government. So, look, I'm much more persuaded, of course, by our policy. I think the Australian public are too. But again, the big question of today's announcement for the Labor Party is how will they fund all their spending promises? And it's just not good enough to keep making announcements without saying where the money's coming from.
I'll come to that in a moment, but this is typically one of those issues you talk about as the barbecue stopper. This affects families. This gives people cash in their pocket. And as I said, it's $2,500 per child extra that people are looking at. Politically, it's very difficult for you to counter this. People are going to like this.
Well, what about being not necessarily liked, but being respected? And people, at the end of the day, know that we have made a major childcare announcement. We are pouring billions of dollars more into childcare, and that we are better targeting that money. Whereas the Labor, plus we're also fully funded and fully costed, whereas the Labor Party do none of those things. And if we are going to get the stronger economy overall, we do need to make the reforms necessary so that we can spend more money on childcare, more money on hospitals and more money on schools. And I think what's lacking in the debate at present, Chris, is that people are talking about growth as an end in itself. Economic growth is only an end if it can deliver better services, be they childcare, health or education or the like. And that's why we've got our company tax cuts. That's why we're seeking, the important bring back the Australian Building and Construction Commission. That's why when it came to childcare, we were driven by the workforce participation dividend and incentive.
Now, when you talk about funding, yes, the Coalition's childcare package is funded by cuts in other family welfare payments, so that's out there. We've all heard about that. It's blocked, I think, in the Senate, though, as we speak.
Yeah.
But when it comes to funding, you know at some stage in the election campaign that the Labor Party will put out their costings, and that they'll be saying that they're saving money by not delivering the company tax cuts, and they'll be shifting money here, there and everywhere. It will add up. They will have costings. It's really about the more fundamental issue here, and that is that Labor says by spending more, it can generate growth and repair the budget, as opposed to the government's plan of trying to keep a rein on spending and trying to cut business taxes. That's the core of the argument, isn't it?
Well, certainly that is at the heart of the argument. As for what Labor puts out, I think there'll be a lot of smoke and mirrors, Chris, because we've been told by Chris Bowen that he's going to wait till 100 days after the election to put out his economic plan, and I think the Australian people deserve better than that and want it before. But when it comes to the company tax cuts, I mean, these are for smallish businesses that may have a turnover between $2 and $10 million. They could be a busy restaurant with 5 to 10 staff, for example. They're being denied a company tax cut by the Labor Party. Now, this goes against, obviously, Paul Keating's legacy, because he significantly cut company taxes, but also goes against the express words of Chris Bowen in his book Hearts and Minds, when he said dropping company taxes will actually spur investment, jobs and growth. It goes against the words of the Shadow Assistant Treasurer, Andrew Lee. It goes against the recommendations of Ken Henry, Labor's hand-picked tax advisor when it came to Kevin Rudd's term in government. It goes against the express words of Penny Wong. So at the heart of the Labor Party's position here is mass hypocrisy, and Bill Shorten himself has said how important cutting company tax is, because we know that for every dollar you cut in terms of company tax, you'll get a $4 dividend to the economy overall. And this is at the heart of the election. Bill Shorten thinks by changing bulk billing rates, you're going to improve the growth and the productivity in the economy. Well, he's wrong. How you're going to improve the growth and productivity in the economy is by cutting the rates of tax, like company tax. It's by spurring innovation through various incentives which we've outlined. It's having a defence capability plan which places a focus on domestic production and businesses in Australia, and it's about unshackling the construction and building sector from, these stop and start disputes run by the unions with the Australian Building and Construction Commission, by bringing that back as a cop on the beat.
But Josh Frydenberg, this is about more than hypocrisy. It's more substantial than that, because people expect all politicians of all persuasions to be hypocritical. Yes, Labor, Bill Shorten, Chris Bowen, Paul Keating, Ken Henry have argued that cutting business taxes will, encourage growth in the economy. I think all Australians understand that rationale. It's pretty orthodox economics. But you're up against a plan where Labor is actually saying, by spending more money on education and more money on Medicare, that somehow that's going to fix the economy. I mean, it's just a dumb argument, because their argument doesn't stack up. Yet they're not but they're not being called out on it. How can such an uneven debate intellectually be basically tied in the public domain?
Well, I think people are starting to take note. The anecdotal feedback I get as I travel around the country is that people are just seeing from Bill Shorten spending, and of course the taxing commitments. That's what they're seeing from him. They're not hearing about a broader narrative, a broader perspective about how to drive the economy.
But they're not hearing him challenged on that. They're not hearing his errors being pointed out by the media. You might want to mention that, but also I would argue by your own side. I don't hear Malcolm Turnbull, Scott Morrison, I don't hear the coalition frontbenchers zeroing in on the fatal flaws in Labor's economic plan daily.
Well, I challenge that, because both Malcolm Turnbull and Scott Morrison have been out all week on this, particularly in light of the very strong economic numbers that we had with the national accounts, where Australia's growth, Chris, was faster than you see in the US, the UK, Canada and other comparable countries.
But Malcolm Turnbull
didn't
do a major press conference yesterday or today, so there's 2 days where he
Well, what Malcolm Turnbull was today doing was he was standing side by side with the CFA, volunteers in Victoria, and by doing that he was saying he will stand up against, the union intimidation backed by the Labor Party, in this case in Victoria, and obviously by Bill Shorten at a federal level. So we saw it with the Road Safety Remuneration Tribunal when Labor, had no understanding or appreciation for the livelihoods of 50,000 owner-operator truck drivers. Now we're seeing it with the CFA volunteers in Victoria, and we know that Bill Shorten is a creature of the union movement. That's where he comes from. That's who he owes his existence from to. He has no other work experience other than that, and that's what he would govern like if he was ever given a chance in the lodge. And Australia can't afford that level of complacency. What we need to do, Chris, is on this issue of fairness, because Labor keeps talking about more money on health and education and childcare, and it's all about fairness. Well, I say to those people, how fair is it that we're burdening the next generation with $1 billion a month on the interest bill of Labor's debt, which will continue to grow if their spending commitments were ever implemented? How fair is it that it costs an extra 30% to build a public hospital in Australia than it should because we don't have the Australian Building and Construction Commission? How fair is it that the owner-operator truck drivers had their livelihoods ripped away by union-friendly legislation? They're the arguments we need to make day after day to win the hearts and minds.
That's exactly my point. You've made these arguments in this interview tonight, but they are not being made day after day. They're not finding their way into the evening news and into the newspapers. Border protection is another major weakness for the Labor Party, but we've seen Malcolm Turnbull mention it in a leaders' debate once, and that's about it. National security, another area of advantage for the coalition, hasn't been mentioned in this campaign. Electricity prices going up because of climate change policy. It's hardly been mentioned. I mean, it seems that there's a bit of complacency about the coalition campaign, and you're waiting for a big advertising campaign to do all the heavy lifting for you.
Well, as you know, this is the longest election campaign in 60 years. Chris, normal campaigns are 33 days. This is a 55-day campaign. So I think there's still a long way to run. But you're right.
But the polls, people start voting on June the 14th for the pre-polls. Maybe as many as 40% of the electorate will have cast their vote before July the 2nd. So you want to have your arguments out there in the next few days, I'd reckon.
Well, in terms of carbon tax, we have been making that repeatedly, that Labor's renewable energy targets and their sort of COP21 targets have not been costed, have not been funded, and will drive up electricity costs as modelled last time when they were in government by Treasury. We've said when it comes to debt, we've been warned by the Departments of Treasury and Finance, we've been warned by the credit agencies, we're being told by the OECD, that spending is an issue. We've got to get it under control. That's why we will do that, but the Labor Party are refusing to heed that message. When it comes to border protection, well, we've seen complete dysfunction and chaos on Labor's side. More than 30 of their candidates and members who are challenging the authority of Bill Shorten on this issue. And we know, like Kevin Rudd, in 2007, he'll say one thing to win votes, but when he's in government, he won't be able to ever deliver on those commitments. So they're the messages that you'll hear from us day after day between now and July the 2nd.
Well, let's have a look at your area of resources and the Adani mine, the massive coal mine proposed for central Queensland, be one of the largest mines in Australia, I think. You are standing solidly behind this proposal, despite the fact that a lot of Greens and environmentalists oppose it because it goes through a port close to the Barrier Reef.
Well, this is another good example where Bill Shorten is trying to walk both sides of the street, because it was the Bligh Labor government in Queensland which determined that this was a project of state significance and gave the whole set of approvals, which have been continued by subsequent Labor governments. We have also given federal approvals, but with the tightest environmental restrictions that are possible. And we understand that this creates tens of thousands of jobs, the coal mining sector in Australia. It's worth over $30 billion in terms of revenue. It's our second largest export. And Australian coal is low in sulphur and low in ash, which means it's a cleaner form of coal, can reduce the emissions by up to 40% in the new power plants than some of the older power plants that are still in operation. And our coal can help provide the fuel necessary, the energy necessary for so many tens of millions of poor people throughout our region, particularly in India.
But the Greens say we should not be opening any more new coal mines. It happens to be our second largest export industry. And certainly many people on the left of the Labor Party would agree with that point of view. Do you think the project has the strong backing of the Labor Party should they win government?
Well, firstly, you've got to distinguish there is two types of coal. There's metallurgical coal, which is for steel, and there's thermal coal, which is for energy. And these people who are opposing any new coal mines, both in the Labor Party and in the Greens, choose to ignore the fact that it takes 220 tonnes of coking coal to actually make a wind turbine for the renewable energy that they rely upon, or for the plane or for the car that Adam Bandt relies on to get to Canberra in any other week. Without the coking coal that we produce here in Australia, we wouldn't have the Whyalla Steelworks. And so Bill Shorten is trying, to disaggregate the issues and to ignore how important coal is here. And the fact is, some of his candidates have even gone as far as to equate coal with heroin. Now, that sounds absurd, but that is what is actually coming out of the mouths of Labor Party candidates. And Bill Shorten needs to stand up to those blue-collar workers right across Queensland, whether they're in the seats of Capricornia or in Herbert or in Flynn. Is he prepared to say to them that he will stand side by side with them to see billions of dollars invested in Australia for this Adani coal mine to provide much-needed jobs in Australia and much-needed energy overseas? We will, but I'm not sure that Bill Shorten will.
Josh Frydenberg, very good to catch up with you. We are out of time, though. Thanks for joining us again on Viewpoint.
Nice to be with you, Chris.
That's Josh Frydenberg, the Resources Minister. Some interesting arguments there across a whole range of issues. I reckon the Coalition need to lift their game. I do reckon they've got some strong arguments on these key issues, some real weaknesses there in the Labor Party. But is it just me thinking that they're not actually prosecuting these very strongly in the day-to-day debate? Let us know what you think on the hashtag Viewpoint on Twitter, or search for the Viewpoint Facebook page and let us know what you think, because my sense is the public hasn't really focused on the campaign, that we haven't had enough energy from either side on this, but in particular the Coalition's attacks on Labor's weaknesses, I reckon, have been almost invisible. I think they're waiting for the advertising campaign to do the heavy lifting for them. Very, very risky strategy. After the break, we'll talk about